This is an oral history of Irwin Ginsburg, who served in the military during World War II.
Before we get into the details here, you realize that in 1940 there was a draft, and everybody had to register for the draft. And like everybody else, I signed up, got a number. I think it was something like 1,502. I thought that might be a pretty high number. As a matter of fact, what happened was I lived in New Jersey, and in December, which is my birthday, I went down and bought a Chevrolet convertible, which was crazy to begin with in December. And the salesman said, "How do you stand in the draft?" I said, "I think I have a pretty high number." Well, 6 months later, I think it must have been 3 months later, I got my notice for induction. So I took the car back. That was the end of that until after the war. So once I got drafted, of course, everything changed. And then I was sent down to Fort MacArthur in San Pedro for assignment, where I was going to take my basic training, everything like that. I took my basic training in Camp Wallace, Texas, which was in Galveston, Texas, which had to be I hate to use the word, but the hellhole of the world. And in fact, while I was there, we went through a 90-mile-an-hour hurricane. I was taking basic training, and that particular night, I was walking guard on a great big field where they used to do maneuvers, and the wind blew so hard it blew the roof off of a lot of the barracks there. But that was one of my first experiences with a hurricane. I was sent back to California for assignment, and I was shipped to a place called Camp Han in Riverside, which at that time, and I don't know if it's still there, it's right across the entrance to March Field,
Okay.
which is still there.
Okay.
And I was assigned to a anti-aircraft artillery division for training. Now, when you're there, or before I got there, you're interviewed to see what your experience has been, what you did for a living, and from that they were supposed to put you where you belong.
According to what you've done.
What I tell them. The fact that at that time I had worked for 5 years for Pep Boys, Auto Supplies, where I stole and stole parts and things like that. I even handled the inventory process for the Pep Boys at that time, because they only had 14 stores. And the first sergeant who was talking to me, interviewing me, said, "What's your hobby?" I said, "My hobby is music. I used to collect records and listen to the big bands." And so he said, "Oh, you must have a good ear then." And he put me in the sound detection unit for when the airplanes come over to bomb. We were on a instrument that had, it was on a platform that revolved, had like 3 big ears, had another helmet that you hooked up with your hoses to those big ears.
Okay.
And when you heard the airplane coming over, when it got to the center of your head, then you gave the signal to the other piece of equipment on your base, which was a 37mm anti-aircraft gun, and these great big searchlights they used to use for store openings. You remember those?
Yeah.
800,000 watt candle power.
So,
yeah.
Okay.
Well, well, that's what I was assigned to. The fact that I should have been in quartermaster never occurred to this guy that interviewed me. On December the 4th, 1941, our whole outfit was told to pack up all of our equipment, guns and searchlights and sound detectors, and come to Los Angeles for 10-day maneuvers. 10-day maneuvers. We bivouacked in Griffith Park, and we set up these anti-aircraft guns and searchlights in different parts of LA and in the mountains and things like that for wherever the warning was going to be. Well, 3 days later is Pearl Harbor.
Right.
So that took care of that. And I was there for quite a while. Although we never had any raids or anything, but the people in LA had to go through, you couldn't drive with your lights on at night, you know.
Okay, that type of stuff, right?
So they had it pretty tough, I guess, because they couldn't do a lot of things they did before. When I was going overseas, when I said send me, I was on board 30 days because they never got complete orders where to go and dock and unload. Every time we went to one particular place, we were told we're going to move on to something else.
Okay. Wow.
And I wound up, I was on the port ship for 30 days. It's a long time. We crossed the equator twice going to where I finally wound up.
Figured out where you could go.
And I wound up at Leyte in Philippines, in a replacement depot, where from there I was going to be assigned to whatever island or whatever job I was going to be assigned to. There's another piece of paper here I want you to see. See this?
Yeah.
When you go overseas and you've never been across the equator, there's a King Neptune. What they do, if you're on board the ship and not a part of that ship, they tell you how to dress, they put your stuff on backwards, everything is crazy, and they put you through a really, what's the word, they throw slop in your face, they'll be in the pool, they take the clippers and went down my head like that, cut off some of my hair. And that's what happens every time when you cross the equator and never crossed before. Now the fact that I crossed the equator twice, the second time I wasn't eligible. Leyte in the Philippines, where I was assigned then to where I was going to be stationed. And I was flown out of there to a little island in the Dutch East Indies called Morotai and Biak. And that was the name of the islands that I was going to go to. And I was going to be the battalion clerk there. And when I got there, I found that the man I was going to replace, who had been there, was somebody that I took my basic training with in Texas, and not seen him for 3 or 4 years. Well, before all this happened now, by replacing him, I came down with an illness in the base of my spine. I had a pilonidal, what they call a pilonidal cyst at the base of your spine, and I had to have surgery. And I went into the hospital there on this island in the same surgery that you saw in MASH, the tent, open sides and stuff like that.
Okay.
Well, I had my surgery there. And because of the humidity and the fact that they didn't sew it up from inside, they used to pack it every day with yards of Vaseline bandage that they would stuff in there and pull it out every day.
Wow.
So after 30 days, nothing was happening, it wouldn't heal up. And I went before a board, and I was shipped to another island in that same chain of the small islands. I was there another 30 days, I didn't give up. And finally, I went before a board, and I was shipped back to the United States, to the General Hospital in Santa Barbara. Now by this time, the war had been on for 4 or 5 years, I guess, and I found out that to be discharged, you had to have 60 points.
Right.
And just each point, how they figure the points. You got 1 month, 1 point for every month of service, 2 points for every overseas month of service,
Okay.
and any activity you had extra points for that. And I figured my points up and came to exactly 60, and I put in for a discharge because I had been told before all this happened I was going to be reassigned to another place, another camp in Texas, like I had done before,
Right.
5 years before. And I couldn't see myself doing that. So finally I got my discharge, and I think my discharge on the papers here is October 31st of October 1945. Now that means I was in the Army 4 years, 3 months, and 9 days.
After the war, Irwin moved back to California, where he eventually met his future wife, Florence. Together they raised 3 children, Peggy, Randy, and Richard. Irwin currently lives in Palm Desert, California.